Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pro's Guide to IBM Security Fundamentals. We're going to be talking about the IBM Power System servers running the IBM operating system. Now, the pro in this equation is me, and I am glad to be with you today. I'm Help Systems Global Director of Security Technologies. I'm a 3-year IBM champion, and I have a whole slew of certifications that basically mean that I spend way too much time working on this technology and spending time looking at security issues and helping customers. So I'm going to try and share some of that information with you today so that hopefully you can become more informed and make great decisions around IBM security. My agenda is pretty brief. We're going to skip over the outside in section. What I mean by that is looking from the network into the box. It's not that it's not an important topic, it's just outside the scope of what we want to focus on, which is perspective one, software approaches, and perspective two, which is services. Now, the outside in, as I said, is very important. In fact, most organizations, this is where security starts. It's the network perimeter. And sadly, for most IBM servers, that's also where it tends to end. Many people's expectation is that the perimeter is arguably impenetrable. Plus, we believe all of the bad actors live beyond its borders. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this often becomes a bit of an undoing for us. Obviously, there is a need for good perimeter protection, but we're not going to be covering that in this session because most of that is handled by different teams than those responsible for the IBM itself. Now, a lot of these technologies might include, of course, a perimeter firewall, but a lot of us are using VPN to work from home nowadays. We also tend to see technologies like multi-factor authentication, and of course, our old favorite SSL or TLS as a modern version in order to ensure all of the communication is encrypted and protected. And there's lots of other additional techniques, lots of other tools that are available in order to assist with this outside-in technology. But at the end of the day, what you want to ensure is that you don't have what we call a flat network. Flat network is where we have a single defense around the perimeter and then really nothing much beyond that, nothing inside. Rather than the flat network, we want to have what we call layered defenses, where we're building out kind of a mesh of controls and procedures that are designed to help slow the bad guy, but still effectively allow people to do their jobs, access the systems and applications and services that they need, while having the protection of individual server controls. Now, we know cyber attacks are increasing much faster than a rate of these resources that are skilled in defending the environment are appearing. Now, people are definitely jumping into this career path, but it takes time for them to show up as an available hire for you. So we have to become more efficient. We have to maintain defenses that are deployed in this layered approach using project-based methodology. What I mean by that is when we go into security, we need to define a goal. We need to set expectations. We need to establish a budget, resources, and document other business initiatives that are going to perhaps be complementary or even compete with this initiative. The interesting thing for me about security is arguably it's never finished, right? Most projects have a start, a middle, and an end. But with security, we have a start, we have a middle, and we have more middle. And so that is a unique thing that people that are not familiar with security or that haven't spent much time working on security are a little bit freaked out by. They're surprised to find that there technically is no end solution because the risks continue to evolve and the applications we use and the technologies that are deployed continue to appear. And so we have to accommodate our security posture in order to make sure that we are handling those as well. The good news is you're not the first person going down this path. So there are a number of frameworks that have been established in order to guide you down this best practice journey. And those include NIST and COBIT and ISO that give us some strategic direction as to how we should secure an environment. We also have a number of different mechanisms within the Help Systems tool bag to help with this, and that ranges from just simple human expertise to, of course, software solutions that can be deployed to assist with these tasks. We only have about 45 minutes together today, so I'm going to hit a few of the highlights to give you a bit of food for thought and some ideas to get started. So we're just really scratching the surface. There's a lot more beyond this conversation, but hopefully this is some motivation to get you started down that path. Now, we get that you likely have a number of other things to do on your agenda, so finding that motivation is important, and make sure that the business supports it. The motivation for your organization to do so may be to prove regulatory compliance and to prevent, of course, becoming the next headline. But at the end of the day, it predominantly boils down to reducing risk. Your own personal motivation may include that security as a highly marketable skill, and you want to have that on your CV or resume. In that way, career growth opportunities become bountiful. So let's assume everybody has an abundance of motivation as they're taking time from your day to listen in. So let's talk about how that can hopefully translate into taking action to secure these power system servers. For me, good security involves two different perspectives combined together. One is the people within your organization and potentially people from outside your organization that can bring in unique skills. We also have software. Now, don't panic. It's not all third-party software. There's a big portion of that software component that is already running on your box, and that's the IBM operating system. We're going to talk about both facets of that. But let's start with the software. As I mentioned, IBM has a huge role to play in the security of your environment. IBM included over the years tons of different security techniques and controls that aid us in ensuring that our database and our applications remain available and secure. Of course, there's also a place for third party. Help Systems has developed over the number of years that we've been in business, now more than 40, a number of tools, software solutions that are designed to help with different facets of IT technology. And in this case, we have a number of security tools that would be relevant to this conversation. But you know what? Let's cover the IBM side of things first. Granted, again, reminding that we're just going to scratch the surface, but one of the things that you want to look at is whether your server is running on a supported operating system version. That includes anything beyond version 7.3 at the moment. 7.2 disappeared in 2020 or 2021. And so if you're on 7.3, 7.4, or if you're an early bird and you've jumped on 7.5 already, then you are supported by IBM. And that's important not only for best practices and making sure you have access to PTFs and support, but it's also necessary for any type of regulatory compliance. Most standard regulations will mandate that you have to be on a supported application version, including the operating system, because of that expectation then of being given support and assistance in keeping your environment up to date. In addition to supporting the operating system version, we also want to make sure that you have a plan and a procedure around applying program temporary fixes. Now, if you're not a long-time IBM person, just know a PTF is like a fix patch. It, in essence, is where issues have been discovered and resolved, and these are the fixes that will address them. Now, we want to make sure that we're putting these PTFs on quite frequently. There are cumulative PTFs, often referred to just simply as cum. There are group PTFs that associate similar PTFs together. And then oftentimes there are also individual PTFs that you may want to apply as well. Right. So not only is this for fixes, but in some instances, IBM will also introduce new features into the operating system via a PTF. This tends to also be a mechanism where they will back level, in essence, a new feature into an older version of the operating system. So even if you don't upgrade, by applying that PTF, you get access to that control feature. One question I often ask of my IBM customers is whether they are auditing the system configuration. Let's perhaps switch the word auditing for inventorying, right? If that helps. We want to know how the system is set up. Are you looking at those things repeatedly to ensure that the system maintains consistency? We also have to consider whether we are capturing and, of course, reviewing the available event data that IBMI is capable of logging. So this audit feature in the operating system, think of it as a flight data recorder, if you will, is built in. The responsibility is yours to turn it on, however. And I'm still seeing a handful of customers every week that are lacking that feature being active. Certainly something you want to take advantage of. Typically no major performance considerations, but there is a disk space consideration. So you don't want to just turn it on blindly and walk away. You want to make sure that you have it appropriately tuned. Now, there's no automatic purging or deletion of that data, although if you're running any type of high availability replication software, there's a good chance that that software is actually deleting that data, arguably over a very short window of time, and certainly something you want to take a look at. As far as inventorying your server, we're going to be looking at things like system values, user profile settings, and object permissions. Doing that once and never repeating it is insufficient. This is something that should be done repeatedly. And depending on the configuration item in your unique business environment, as far as, how many users do you add in a week? Those types of reviews should be done on a regular cadence. What we know is that the majority of security incidents that occur on any platform are due to misconfiguration, not due to any particular weakness. In fact, IBMI is extremely robust when it comes to security. And we know that operating systems outside of IBMI may not be quite as robust, but in most instances, a simple misconfiguration is the guilty party. And that means that it is avoidable. It is something that you can resolve and close the risk on, or at least reduce the risk significantly, without actually having to do much more than maintain the operating system. Speaking of which, how often do you review those system values? And have they been compared to some type of validated baseline? In the modern IBMI operating system versions, there's over 150 different system values, and a number of those are pertaining to security. The thing to bear in mind with system values is they're extremely important. The IBM default settings for those system values may not always be the recommended settings. In fact, during a review that I do with a lot of customers, oftentimes we find that their system is still sitting at the IBM configured default, and it flags it as high risk. And that's simply because those settings are not appropriate in the current day and age. Bear in mind that system values are often influenced by other attributes and metrics, meaning that it's great to be at security level 50, for example, but if all of your users have all object special authority, you're running at the equivalent of security level 20. And if you're familiar with those settings, you may chuckle and think, why would you ever do that? And I would agree, you shouldn't, but people do. And so that's definitely something you want to consider. The analogy I use of some of these system values is kind of like an expensive alarm system on your car. It's great to have it. It has a lot of function and it protects you in certain ways. But if you leave the keys in the ignition and the doors and windows open, then it's really not going to help you a whole lot. So system values are extremely important, but you cannot look at them in a vacuum and expect to be successful. Part of the challenge in the IBMI world is these system values are not still sitting as they were on the new system that you're running. So imagine you buy a brand new Power 10 server, load this thing up, but you don't load it from scratch, do you? You tend to load it up from a mirror image that you took off of the previous system that you were running. Not only does that bring the application and the data over, but it also tends to bring over the user accounts, the profiles, and it also brings over the system values. So what we're doing over time is propagating these values from system to system. If you don't know of a strong baseline, be aware that the Center for Internet Security, CIS, now has established benchmarks for IBMI starting in version 7.2 and on. So 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, and are currently working on recommendations for 7.5. There are a number of enhancements for security in version 7.5, and the benchmark is going to now accommodate those recommendations as well. So it's an exciting opportunity for you to finally have something to compare your environment against. However, I want you to be cognizant of the fact that you're not the only one who has access to those recommendations, and the recommendations are often in the context of resolving a shortcoming. So if the bad actors have access to that information, they are much more educated on where most people's systems sit for a configuration and where those weaknesses lie. What about passwords? How strong is your password environment? Bear in mind that passwords tend to, in many instances, be the only mechanism to protect our data. We do support single sign-on in the IBMI world. So if you're using Kerberos or other single sign-on technologies in other platform environments, IBMI can play in that, and it's included and free within the operating system. The common or the most popular conversation at the moment for me around user provisioning and user management is in terms of multi-factor authentication. We have seen out that insurance providers have now established multi-factor authentication as a baseline requirement for any type of cyber insurance policy. They did that almost overnight. It went from a recommendation to a mandate, and all of a sudden the phones lit up and people were scrambling to fulfill that requirement in order to renew their policy. It is possible to do MFA on IBMI, although it tends to use some type of third-party application, one of which is a Help Systems PowerTech multi-factor authentication product. You also want to ensure that you're using secure connections for all of your TCP/IP services that support them. For example, if you are using Access Client Solutions or Client Access in its previous iteration, know that the emulation session, for example, by default is exposed, meaning that when you sign in to that green screen environment, not only is your user ID being transmitted, but your password is also being sent across the network in the clear. And anybody sniffing packets off of the wire are going to have access to that information. You can verify in Client Access, Access Client Solutions, whether your emulation session is secure using the little padlock icon that I think many of us have become familiar with over the years that we see in the browser when we're shopping online. Make sure you have that browser and also the IBMI session in a padlocked environment so that you know that all the communication between the client and the server is going through an encrypted tunnel. Make sure you're checking for any bad defaults. As I mentioned, IBMI does not always come with optimal settings. And then you want to make sure you have a good policy established and, most importantly, enforce it. And enforce it entails checking it or verifying it and then making changes as appropriate. And I do understand sometimes the changes are not to your system, it may be to your policy. So reevaluating your policy for the appropriateness of it, probably once a year, is definitely recommended. User profiles are a big part of the security configuration and exposure for IBMI. The administrative profiles are going to be determined by their capabilities, not the role that that person has been hired to fulfill. This is a very common conversation with MFA, which is being dictated, like I said, by a lot of insurance companies who indicate that administrative accounts should use MFA. Now, some insurance providers want all users to do it. And what's the difference? Well, admins have to be defined. What is an admin to you? May not be the same as the definition to me. So it's important that you ensure that if you are doing this for outside influence, like an insurance provider, that you and they both agree on the definition of an admin, because if there is a disconnect and a claim is filed, there is possibility that they will reject that claim because they'll say that you did not follow the guidelines. It is not based on the fact that the person has admin in their role title. It's based on the capabilities that that profile has on the system. Oftentimes, this is through the 8 special authorities that can be granted to a user or inherited from a group. We call them special authorities, but they are administrative privileges. But the bottom line is they're special and they should only be given in rare occasion. If you can, take away the ability for users to utilize command lines. Many of you do this already, I know that. And so the limit capability attribute on a profile is going to be helpful and drive this by granting non-limited capabilities. It's kind of backwards how most people look at it. So you want to say limit capabilities, yes, ideally. That means the user has access to only a handful of commands like sign off and display job. That can be helpful. We also want to make sure that any profiles that retain command line privileges or that have been classified properly as admins have command auditing active on them. That means that the commands that they're entering on the command line are being logged into that flight data recorder that we talked about a few slides ago. The big takeaway here is to remember that people hacking your environment are using your profiles. They don't come in through some magical flying carpet. They're signing in as Bob in the warehouse, and that's because they figured out what Bob's credentials are. So let's make sure that those credentials are appropriate. They have still life left in them. They're not kind of abandoned profiles. They are not disabled, ideally, unless they need to stay disabled as a service account, and that there is good password policy and hygiene around that profile management. What about the integrated file system and the other ways that users can connect into the box? Many of us are using drive shares, mapping a drive in Windows so that it looks at a folder within the integrated file system. However, this is a way to easily introduce malware to the IBM I. And yes, that is a thing. Best practices state that you should never ever share that root folder of the IFS. Why? Well, under the root folder is your operating system. And under the operating system folder sits all your native applications. So if I get access to the root, there is exposure, especially if my user profile is privileged. Make sure you're overseeing any IFS drive share connections using the IBM supplied file server exit point. If you're not familiar with exit points, I really encourage you to become familiar. There is information on the Help Systems website about this for reading material, also with some webinars. Definitely an important conversation to have. Utilizing that exit point means that we can apply an exit program that arguably is going to police and audit those PC connections. If you can, make your shares read-only. That will protect you from ransomware and again, monitor those connections. If you are intending to go to version 7.5, or if you've already made that leap, there's some additional controls that allow us to designate that connections are specifically read-only and or that they are policed by authorization lists. But there's a number of different mechanisms at your disposal in order to ensure that only good information is being placed on the IFS and data is not leaving the IFS as a potential risk avenue. All right. Speaking of these PC connections, which of them are you controlling? The IFS is just one way. There's also ODBC, FTP, DDM, RExec, and the list goes on. Utilizing exit programs to oversee these connections is just as important as it is for the IFS. The good news is the operating system utilizes these exit programs that you provide or you write in order to be able to log these different connection methods. Most people don't want to write their own, so this is a great opportunity for third party, but it is possible to write your own if necessary. This, in my opinion, is the largest attack vector that is against your IBM I. Why? Because most of these interfaces are not unique to IBM I. We're not special in that we have the capability of doing ODBC and JDBC connections or FTP. Let's face it, they're on virtually every platform. And so if we are not controlling those mechanisms and watching for abuse of those mechanisms, we may be missing the boat when it comes to detecting violations of our security policy. If you have a menuing environment for your users that corrals their function, just understand it is completely ineffective in this PC world. When you sign into FTP, you're not going to get presented with that fancy application menu that you've been using for 30 years. We also have to acknowledge that that limit capability attribute that is associated with a command line restriction is also not 100% effective here. There are still commands that can be run against FTP. There are still interfaces that don't even check that setting. So while I do encourage that limit capability attribute to be assigned, we have to truly understand and acknowledge its limitations and make sure we have compensating controls in other areas. All right, so the 300-pound gorilla in the room here, maybe that's a lightweight gorilla, is object level security. Many of you have heard of this. You may have dabbled in it a little bit, But what it comes down to is this is the main IBMI object-based authority control, and it's a very powerful and important layer. Question is, have you used it? It's very intimidating to people that have not been trained in it, right? So we tend to be very fearful of making changes out of the concern that we're going to break an application that is functioning perfectly well. So in that instance, then we use the IBM supplied defaults. And the problem here is that the IBM defaults have always been allow all. So if you're following recommendation and you are trying to assign based on a principle of least privilege, which is just a cool way of saying by default, nobody has access, and then the authorized users are granted that access, meaning the doors are locked by default, and then the authorized users have the keys. Understanding that the operating system actually comes in the opposite configuration is an important acknowledgement, right? The doors are wide open until we lock specific people out, and that's not ideal. So that principle of least privilege, bit of a mouthful there, is intended to resolve that. And so object level security is not pre-configured ideally. It's definitely something that you want to at least acknowledge, take a look at, determine if it's going to be applicable to your environment. And at the end of the day, object level security, OLS, is applied to all of the different interfaces. And the challenge with OLS is, like I said, it's quite intimidating to the unindoctrinated, but there are tools provided starting in version 7.3 to assist you with the task of determining the appropriate object level security settings. So a lot of the guesswork has been taken out of this process, which is reducing the likelihood that you're going to break something. The biggest concern I have with object level security is the limitation that says that it is inflexible. It does not give the ability to set different authority levels for different interfaces. So the ability to connect into the system and view data is going to be the exact same on the green screen as it is to ODBC, as it is to FTP. And for many of us in the IBMI community, what we're trying to do is establish variable settings based on the different connections and the different applications. And so object level security should be the baseline, but then things like exit programs can give us some flexibility and provide the capability to set different levels. All right, that's just, again, scratching the surface of some of the features that you should be considering on the IBMI side of the house. Now I want to touch just a little bit on some of the features that help systems can augment the operating system with and provide assistance to help you secure. This is what I call the solution wheel. There are many, many security products within the Help Systems family of brands, growing almost daily it seems. But when it comes to IBMI, we have a very comprehensive portfolio that we call the PowerTech brand. And this PowerTech brand has capabilities that range from determining vulnerabilities to doing auditing of an environment, applying virus protection, exit programs that we've talked a little bit about, and even encryption of your data at rest. Now, each of these segments within the wheel corresponds to different modules within the product family. So you can choose and cherry pick which applications are going to solve your particular business challenges. Everything, as I said, from MFA to self-service password functions, native virus protection, extremely popular now, and other tools like encryption and protection of the IBMI perimeter. However, there's a lot to choose from here, and that may seem intimidating if you have not worked on security or we've not had a conversation before. So we don't jump in at the deep end. Let's start with something relatively basic, and that means assessing where your environment is today. I usually recommend anybody who's not had an assessment performed or that has had an assessment performed in the past, but it's been, say, more than a year, that they take a look at their environment. We do have a deep dive offering, but what I'm highlighting here is actually a free review. This utilizes a PC tool that can be loaded up in your environment that you point towards any or all of your IBMI partitions, and it will go out and assess the environment. It only takes a matter of seconds, and it will return to you a 10 or 12 page document, actually via a browser initially, but you can turn it into a PDF that is yours to keep or share. No restrictions, no obligation. This is completely available to you at no cost. We make it so that you have a 7-day license to utilize the software. It's not intended for long-term use because it doesn't necessarily provide all of the granular depth that you would need in order to prove, for example, regulatory compliance. We can do those type of assessments, but of course, we're a business entity and we charge for that type of function. But this introduction is still extremely beneficial. And I have most customers saying, wow, this was really worth our time, even though they may have questioned the validity of a free scan up front. They certainly were glad that they did the exercise. Now, as I mentioned, it provides this at no cost. If you are not familiar with IBM Security and you're concerned you won't know how to interpret the results, then I would be happy to sit down with you and explain exactly what each of the X's and check marks means. I've got other folks on my team that do that as well. And literally, we perform hundreds of these throughout the world for customers every year. So take advantage of this. In fact, if you are interested, I'm going to just pop up a very quick poll here. If you are interested in doing it, let me know. If you're kind of piqued your curiosity, but you'd like more information about it, you can let me know that as well, and we'll be happy to get some details on what it looks at, what it doesn't look at, how it runs, the ethics behind what we're doing there. We can have all those conversations before you make any commitment. All right, so take advantage of that. If you choose not to check yes right now, but you change your mind and you want to do this later on, just head out to helpsystems.com, go into the cybersecurity tab, and you can sign up online for security scan. Or if you have a contact at Help Systems, just give them a buzz and let them know that you're interested in doing the free security scan, and we'll be happy to set that up for you. All right, I'll just give you a second or two more to answer that, and then we will move on. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. And like I said, if you did sign up, we'll be in touch and we'll get that executed for you. All right, so again, a lot of different solutions here, but like I said, not only restricted to IBMI, we have a whole slew of different product brands, household names that you may be familiar with, like Alert Logic and Tripwire and Digital Defense. These are all brands within the Help Systems families of products. We're very excited to have that expansion in our capability as Help Systems grows. Now remember that the software category also encompasses line of business applications. We often see, horrific examples, arguably, of security from even reputable software vendors. So if your vendor says to you, everybody needs all object special authority, then I really encourage you to push back on them, as it is 100% untrue. And we do still, in this day and age, get commentary like that. We also see where companies have not followed their vendor's instructions. So the vendor did their part and built an application, but during the install, there was a step that wasn't followed, or there were instructions that are not being adhered to. And this ends up with non-conforming configurations. Of course, resolving the latter scenario is much easier. In a sense, we're now swimming downstream with the vendor, but if the vendor's claiming that their application can't run at security level 40, or you need all object, it's going to fall on you to either find a different vendor, or more realistically, have to do some configuration on your own to try and reduce the risk of that inadvertent application environment. Performing an inventory of the business software is a good place to start. A security specialist can certainly help determine where the application falls on the security scale by looking at object ownership, public and private permissions on those objects, and the profile configuration that the vendor recommends. And then they can give suggestions on how to approach mitigation, including how effective any compensating controls may be in that world. It's important to remember that your menus and your application security are fantastic as long as the user is within the application. But we also have to ensure that users can't simply download or alter the data from outside the application. So don't just assume that the user is doing what you expect and control them in that world. We have to anticipate that the user is doing things against the rules, such as a hacker or a disgruntled employee, and that we have protection in those worlds. And at the end of the day, it's not always about malicious actions either. Many of the calls that we take are because somebody had access to something beyond their business requirement and they made a mistake. Simple as that. They deleted a file and they had the incorrect library list. That's not uncommon. Or they ran a command and inadvertently did something to the runtime environment. They ended a subsystem or ended all subsystems. And while those things can be resolved, it's definitely disruptive to the business flow. Okay, so that completes today's coverage from the software side of things. So let's touch now on the services side of the house. Right? That's important as it's needed to take full advantage of what that software has to offer. So the first question you want to ask is whether you want to own your own security initiatives. Is this an area that you feel comfortable and competent in? Do you have the time as well as the resources? First of all, have you identified what those mitigation priorities are to know what that offer or that effort entails? Security is not something most of us have been trained in the IBMI community. We've picked it up as we've gone along, which means we've learned from others and potentially picked up bad habits as well as good habits. If you don't have the time or the wherewithal to kind of add another task to your daily responsibilities, then certainly turning to outside experts can be a popular option. First thing you want to do is review and identify the types of risks that can be addressed quickly, like the proverbial low-hanging fruit. Also identify what is very impactful, the high-risk items. And you're going to build kind of a matrix because you want to work on the things that are easy to fix, but that move the dial or move the needle dramatically. Those are the things to work on first. If you do have limitations on time or the expertise in-house, then consider a trusted partnership with a firm such as Help Systems in order to augment that staff with people that can do knowledge transfer as well as assist with the tasks. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but security is not a project arguably you will ever fix. It's certainly also not a project that you will resolve overnight. So the thing that I recommend is that you put yourself on a path of continual improvement. You're going to work towards better security, and that's going to take time. So by chipping away at that thing, you're going to make improvements a little bit at a time. There are certainly things that can be mitigated that will move the needle a lot. Those tend to be few and far between, but they are out there. And so we encourage mitigation of those challenges and risks first to get yourself kind of started. And then it's like a comet, it tails off. And so it's up to you to decide how far you want to go on that journey based on budget and expectation and your requirements. Don't expect to have everything addressed by Thursday of next week, right? It's not realistic. The risks that you're facing are changing all the time. So by the time you get to next Thursday, you may have a different objective anyway. You want to build out a course that spans the short, medium, and long term, and that can be a multi-year initiative, right? A lot of us in the IBMI community have spent little, if anything, on security over the years. We've kind of believed that the platform was already secure. And so conversations like this can be a little bit painful because we've got a lot of catching up to do. So we want to set this out as kind of a long-term strategy with short-term and medium-term goals intermixed, and acknowledge that it's not just set it up once and walk away and think that it's going to stay appropriate. We need to re-review. And the cadence in which you re-review is going to be dependent on a number of different variables, including your business environment and the types of applications you're running. If your users are pretty typical and despise passwords, certainly there are conversations to be had. I mentioned earlier that single sign-on is incorporated within IBMI. It just has to be set up. Multi-factor authentication is something we're helping a ton of customers with right now, thanks to the insurance industry, and definitely something that is going to reduce the risk dramatically, because when an administrative account especially signs onto the system and I can validate that the user signing in is who they are claiming to be, then I've eliminated a lot of the exposure of outside people utilizing Bob in the warehouse's profile and doing things that perhaps Bob would not normally himself do. Make sure your users are set up in a role-based environment. Don't give administrative privileges to a person that is not an administrator. And we see that day in and day out. Try to do a review or a inventory of your profile so that you can clean up dormant or orphaned accounts before years and years have gone by. It's shocking how often I audit an environment and I find profiles for people that left potentially decades before. I did a review of a customer one side and they had to break the news to me that one of the profiles I was questioning belonged to an employee that had actually passed away many years previously. And that profile was still sitting there. Now, I get the challenges if you've attempted to delete a profile in the past and you've said, but they own 8,000 things and I'm concerned, what do I do with those objects? I totally get it. And that's part of the, process is reviewing when a profile is created and exists on the system. How is object ownership managed, right? So these are the conversations to be had so that we stop the bleeding and stop creating that issue, and then we start addressing the existing ones that are already there. So all of these things have been presented to other customers and these challenges have been overcome. It's just a matter of finding the techniques to do it. And certainly expertise, perhaps in the security realm, maybe not even internally, but an outside resource can give you great pointers there and help you benefit from other people's journey. I mentioned, making sure that your PC to IBMI connections are secure and that your broadcast of credentials is done through a secure channel. Now, in this instance, what we're doing in essence is just making sure that that configuration is established. The IBMI operating system has a lot of these feature functions built into it, but you have to configure them and utilize them. So that SSL/TLS capability within Access Client Solutions and Client Access doesn't cost you anything, but it requires you to set up a digital certificate and establish that relationship between the client and the server. We have information on our website about how to accomplish that particular task. We're updating that for 7.5 because there's a number of things that are now different, but in lieu of that, then certainly have some conversations with people that can walk you through this task. It's not difficult. Once you've done it a couple times, you go, that's all there is to it. But I do understand that first time can be intimidating, and so asking for help is certainly respected. Making sure you're on common operating system and PTF version gives you access to connections and connection security, and understand that IBM is able to be its own digital certificate authority. Otherwise, if your organization has a digital certificate authority already, you can utilize that. But recognizing that these connection methods like Telnet, which is the green screen, and FTP and others are by default not secure means that you have acknowledged one of the biggest risks and you can work to mitigate it. So that's our two perspectives, people and software. Software encompassing both IBMI operating system functions as well as third-party software functions are going to be your best friend when it comes to resolving these issues. If you're intimidating on knowing where to start and therefore you don't, that is not uncommon. It's probably the biggest challenge I see people running into is they don't really have a start line to kick off from. Now, as I mentioned, security is like every other project in that its recipe for success is to start by defining what the requirements are, evaluating how that mitigation is going to occur, implement the mitigation steps, and then review for project success. Now, I did mention security is also unlike every other project in that there is no often end goal, but that doesn't mean that your kind of medium-term goals can't be evaluated and say, look, we're going to put in a VPN. We've done that. Okay, what's next? We're going to secure and correctly set our IBMI security system values. We can monitor the success of that facet of the project. Yes, security as an entity, never ending, but the steps to gain better security absolutely can be evaluated and addressed. All right. If you need to partner with a firm outside of your organization, make sure you select a firm that you trust and that understands the unique status of this server platform. We see so many people getting evaluations, pen testing done by Windows experts, and that's great. We encourage that type of review. In fact, we do that type of review through other non-IBMI brands. But on the IBMI, we know the box is unique. Just scanning for open ports is not the be all and end all of everything. We need to understand our system values, our profile attributes, and our object permissions. And oftentimes those vendors have no clue what any of that means. So find a firm that you trust. Find a firm that works in the space a lot and that has a proven track record, not only for software, but also in the people that work there and their knowledge of the operating system. Remember, the return on investment of security is going to be different for everybody, but ultimately before a security incident, one could argue that there's really zero ROI. But after a security incident occurs, that ROI boosts up to pretty much unlimited, right? I see that with customers that have called me, had security conversations, opted to not spend money or to do any mitigation and kind of keep their fingers crossed, only to call me back at a later date in a mad panic because something happened, often accidental, but sometimes malicious, and that they're scrambling, trying to undo the damage that has been sowed, whether it was from recovering from ransomware or simply restoring objects that have been deleted or corrupted. And they will spend any amount of money to resolve that issue, oftentimes because it's their head on the chopping block and they kind of appreciate having a career. So in that instance, we want to protect you as an individual, but also protect the organization by putting those controls in place before the incident occurs and you're scrambling to mitigate. All right, everybody, I threw a lot of info at you. If you have any questions, I'll hang out for a few minutes here. We'll check the question panels. I did have somebody ask about the security scan and where to obtain that. If you did check that you wanted that scan, we'll reach out and get that information to you. If you're one of the folks that chose a maybe or not at this time, well, we'll get you more info if you said maybe, but if you said not at this time, you can always go out anytime and go out to helpsystems.com and download the software. If you are a repeat user of the software, you will get a license error because it's only good for 7 days, in which case just let us know. And like I said, if it's been more than a year, around a year, it's not a hard limit. Just let us know. We'll get you a license key that'll extend that out for you. All right. Nadeem asking about how do you set up IDS? I assume what you are speaking of is the intrusion detection system that is incorporated into IBMI. Kudos to you for knowing that even exists. Most people don't. The intrusion detection is also an intrusion protection system, so it's an IDS IPS. And what that is, for those of you not familiar, is that it can monitor your TCP/IP ports and it can detect kind of unauthorized activity. It's looking for denial of service attacks and other types of packet anomalies, and it can even throttle them down if appropriate. Setting that up is done through the operating system, through Navigator, I believe, or System Director. We do that through our services team. We help customers set it up. My understanding from them is that they can set it up pretty easily with you. There are some default policies that can be incorporated. Otherwise, they can adjust those uniquely for you. So I'm not quite sure in what context, Nadeem, you're asking how can you set it up. It's just something in the operating system you have to go in and configure. You turn it on and you set policy around it. All right. Todd, long question there. All right, toying with a customer password validation program, wondering if there is a security risk in that the exit point sends the password as a parameter to the validation program. Could that be intercepted? It's not sent across the wire though, so that's kind of the make or break on that. But just understand, if there is a program registered either to the password validation system value or registered through a system registry entry, there is possibility that that validation program is not authorized. So I encourage people to verify that that value is set in the way you expect it to be quite frequently. So a program not expected is audited and verified. Where did this program come from? What does it do? Because it could technically capture passwords. If it's an authorized exit program or system value program, that's fine. To my understanding, there's no security risk per se, other than the fact that programmatically that program could be doing unauthorized things. All right. So hopefully that answers your question. If you want to clarify if I missed the point, then please feel free to post. Nadim, you said you have something in PT also to set it up. PowerTech, I'm assuming. Nothing in PowerTech is doing direct IDS, so I'm not quite sure what you're using there. If you're referring to our exit point manager tool, which is our exit program solution, then certainly that is monitoring based on users or IP address of legitimate connections, or let's say validated connections. It's not looking for denial of service. Exit point manager is saying, hey, Nadim is connecting into FTP and doing a file upload or a remote command. Is that expected, and should we log it, and should we let somebody else know that that command is being run? So it's kind of overseeing the authenticated connections versus the IDS IPS environment that happens arguably anonymously through packet connections. And that's why I use the example of a denial of service attack. Any other questions? Those are good questions. All right. Good deal. Well, I appreciate that. And thanks again for attending. Hopefully you enjoyed this session. I enjoyed presenting it to you. And we'll look forward to seeing you on an upcoming session. But stay tuned, www.helpsystems.com. If you're not part of our IBMI Insider Forum, I encourage you to seek that out and sign up for that. It's a great resource if you want to ask questions around IBMI security or make comments. That's a new thing that we started relatively recently, but all of our team at Help Systems appreciates you, whether you're a customer today or a customer tomorrow. We definitely appreciate it. We enjoy serving the IBMI community, and we're here for you on any of your security requirements, IBMI or otherwise. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the remainder of your day.